If for the prize we have striven, after our labors are o'er, rest to our souls will be given on the eternal shore. Oh, the soul of the beautiful, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, He is the light of the soul. So we are weak, sighing for home, longing for Thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea. Yes, the sweet rest is remaining for the true children of God, where there will be no complaining, never a chasing blood. Home of the soul, beautiful home, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, He is the light of the soul. Lonely are we, sighing for home, longing for Thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea. Soon the bright home and adorning, we shall behold the glad dawn. Lean on the Lord till the morning, trust till the night is gone. Home of the soul, beautiful home, there we shall rest, never to roam, free from all care, happy and bright. Jesus is there, He is the light of the soul. So we are weak, sighing for home, longing for Thee. Beautiful home of the ransom beside the crystal sea, the crystal sea.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our midweek Bible study. Before you grab the remote, you're in the right place. This is Roger's Rise and Build, Reflections from the Joseph Story midweek Bible study. I'm honored to be able to sit in and pinch hit for Roger this week, so you are in the right spot. Looking forward to being able to study with you tonight. I hope your day has went well. I appreciate so much you spending just a few minutes tonight to engage in this Bible study with me. I'm looking forward to it. I hope that you will find it refreshing. Tonight, we will continue this theme of Rise and Build, these stories from the life of Joseph, and we're going to be looking at this topic, distinguishing between rubble and rubies. Now, before we dig into that context, I want to pull us back for just a moment. I want us to think for just a moment about this concept of rubble. You've had a busy day, you've been running to work, to school, you're probably sitting down and having your dinner right now, and want to kind of pull you into this topic tonight. And I would like you to begin with the mental image of rubble all around you. You might recall that Roger began this series way back in January with a passage from the book of Nehemiah chapter 4. And in that passage, Roger took us through the picture that is painted for us in that book of God's people coming back from exile, beginning the very difficult work of rebuilding the walls of Jerusalem that had been destroyed. And in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 10, the people were paralyzed. They stopped work and said, there is rubble all around us. And they were unable to proceed because of that rubble. And I want you just to begin to formulate that mental image of standing in rubble for just one moment. Now, let me bring some common current events to your mind that may help you with this particular thought. Many of you may recall the image on the left side of your screen, the image in the days just following the attack in New York City on 9/11. That image of that firefighter walking through that rubble. And you recall those scenes. You recall just the enormous amount of rubble from those buildings that had fallen that were in many, many blocks. And you just step back and you can kind of sense that paralysis. How can we move forward? How can we begin to clean this up? How can we begin to restore any order whatsoever? Or the picture on the right of your screen. This is following a recent hurricane in the Bahamas. Look at that devastation. Look at that destruction. Can you imagine walking out of whatever shelter you were in during that storm and being confronted with this pile of rubble. Roger has been very deliberate to take us through this concept of rubble each and every week of this class, talking about rise and build. And I want you to think about this image. I want you to think about whether it's the image of Nehemiah chapter 4 and the people standing looking at the rubble of the wall, whether you're reminded of the images of New York City following 9/11, whether you are reminded of just those horrific pictures following a hurricane in the Bahamas or in many other areas where hurricanes have been so devastated, thinking about that image of rubble. Back in August, our shepherds and our evangelists came together for a meeting, and we began to think about what would be the theme for 2021. Now, in August, we were still very much in the middle of the pandemic. We were on the heels of a lot of civil unrest. We were confronted with just ahead of us a very contentious election. There was a lot going on, and we were thinking about what would be the right theme. What would be the right theme to bring to our church family that might be useful for you, that might be useful for your family, that might help you grow and continue to grow toward a relationship with God? And we were talking about the storm that we have been in 2020 and the storm that would be continuing into 2021, and what would be the right theme. We used a fairly unusual source of inspiration to begin that meeting. We actually read a news article from a newspaper in the state of Florida. It was a newspaper article that referenced a research study that had been conducted by a coroner in Florida. This coroner had spent years studying decades worth of data about deaths following storms in and around the state of Florida. And the headline was catching to us. It was what caught our attention. The headline said more people die after a storm than actually during the storm. And that really struck us from a spiritual perspective. We began to think about the fact that spiritually we were very much in the middle of a storm. We were unable to meet in August the way we had really been wanting to meet. We still have not been able to do so today. We were thinking about all the tensions that were going on in our church family. We're talking about and thinking about the storm, the rubble that was around us, and thinking about, how do we deal with that? And one is tempted to look at the storm you're confronted with and just say, I'm glad it's behind me, or I can't wait till it's behind me, and put it in the rearview mirror and move on. But we were thinking about there's still a lot of danger even after the storm. And so this concept of after the storm began to be very real to us, that in 2021, as this storm begins to wind down, we want to ensure that you and your family and our church family as a whole is spiritually safe and in no way in danger. And so this concept of rubble is really what began to drive our thoughts, because it is in that rubble following a storm that death so often occurs. Now, I'd like to begin tonight with just asking you to reflect upon a very brief question. I would like for you just to think for just a moment about this question. What rubble is in your life as we begin February of 2021? For some, it may be a struggle with your marriage. Been a lot of people spending a lot of time together over the past year. Divorce rates are skyrocketing through this country. Perhaps you have a strain in your own marriage. Perhaps that's rubble that you're dealing with. Maybe it's financial. Maybe the economic hardships of the past year have hurt you financially, and you're struggling with maybe paying some bills, and that is a distraction, and that's rubble in your life. It could be any number of things that you might be dealing with. You may be just simply overwhelmed with the circumstances. You may be discouraged with all that's going on, the things that have been canceled, the things that have been postponed, the things that you've not been able to do, the people you've not been able to be with. Whatever it might be, it's very possible that you have rubble in your life today. Just take a moment to reflect upon that. Write down what that rubble might be. But I would also ask you for just a moment tonight to also think about this question. Why is the time following a storm so dangerous? I just mentioned to you that article that referenced that in the state of Florida, more deaths occurred after a hurricane than during the hurricane. Why is that? Why is it that after a storm sometimes is more dangerous than during the storm? Well, from a spiritual perspective, I would ask you to kind of think about that just a bit. Why is it that 2021, as the storm of the pandemic, the storm of all the civil unrest, the storm of a contentious election, everything we experience begins to wind down, and we pray that it will, why is that still a dangerous time? Well, spiritually speaking, because you're distracted, because you could possibly be discouraged, because you've been disconnected, because your rhythms have been interrupted in terms of serving God. It could be any number of those things that could be causing it to be dangerous for you spiritually. I want you to think about this concept of rubble, the rubble in your life from a spiritual perspective, the danger that may be in your life while rubble is around you in your life. And that really is the very basis of why this class came about, why Roger is bringing this class to us each and every week as we continue to look at the concept of rise and build. When you are standing in that rubble, when that rubble is in your life, you have two choices: become overwhelmed and become a casualty of it, or be resolved to rise up and build your life spiritually by growing closer to God. And so Roger has chosen this walk through the life of Joseph to help us be encouraged, to help us see a real-life example of someone who time and time again was confronted with rubble in his life, and yet he continued to overcome. And so thus far, Roger has taken us through the rubble of family troubles. We talked a lot with Roger about the contentious relationship between Joseph and his brothers and the dysfunction in his family. That was rubble that he had to deal with. We talked about the rubble of finger pointing, the false accusations that Potiphar's wife made against Joseph. Roger took us through the lesson of the rubble of forgotten promises and how the cupbearer forgot to talk to Pharaoh about Joseph and left him in prison. And he was let down by someone that he had hope and trust in. And then we also, with Roger, talked about the rubble of forgetting that God is near. A God who is with us is the reminder that we get when we look at the Joseph story. This class is purposeful. It is intentional. It is helping you think about what rubble is in your life. How do you avoid becoming a casualty of that rubble? And how do you rise and build your spiritual life closer to God? And I hope that you have been taking part in this class. If you've not picked up those lessons, they're still freely available to you on our website at charlestonroad.org, and we hope that you'll pick those up. But with that said, let's continue to tonight's class. Distinguishing between rubble and rubies. I want you to think for just a moment about this life of Joseph just a little bit more deeply, and I want for just a moment to kind of walk through this contrast of the rubble that was in the life of Joseph, yet the ruby that he was able to find. That's our topic tonight. How is it that we see good amongst evil and bad? And Joseph, time and time again, was able to do that. And so let's walk through just a couple of quick examples of that. For example, the rubble in the life of Joseph was that his brothers sold him into slavery. Can you imagine that concept of being in the field with your brothers throwing you in a pit, and when a caravan comes by of wanderers, you are sold to them and taken to Egypt as a slave? What a tremendous, devastating occurrence in one's life. That was slavery. But how did Joseph see the ruby in that? Well, he wound up in Egypt, and rather than being distraught, he chose to serve with honor. He rose very quickly into being the head of Potiphar's home, and so he turned that rubble into a ruby. Another example, we just mentioned a moment ago, Potiphar's wife made false accusations against Joseph. He was cast into prison. He had done nothing wrong, and yet he was punished and cast into prison. Not a pleasant place to be by any means. And yet, while in prison, he made it his choice to be the best possible prisoner, to be the best he could be, and he quickly rose to be the head of the prison as a prisoner. Again, the example of a rubble in his life being turned into a ruby. But then we look at this example of him being forgotten. He interpreted the dreams of the baker and the cupbearer. The cupbearer was released. went to Potiphar. Joseph had asked him to say a good word for him, and yet he did not. He did not say a good word on his behalf, and he was forgotten and left in prison. Yet, once again, while that rubble in his life was around him, he was learning the patience on waiting for God. He saw the opportunity to continue to wait on God and be patient for him. Rubble turned to ruby. We look at the bitterness that he could have very easily had. You may recall, skip ahead in the story of Joseph. Here he is now risen. He gets out of prison. He rises to the head of all of Egypt, in control of all of the food. And his brothers come to visit, and he has the opportunity to be very bitter toward them for all that they had done. And yet we see that he chose not to be bitter, but he chose to represent himself with care and realize that he could have an impact not only on his family, but on those around him. Rubble turned to ruby. And then we look at the revenge that he might have had upon his brothers. He had every opportunity to get revenge for what they had done for him so many years ago, but we didn't see that in his life. We see the ruby that he chose to bring forward, and that is a heart of forgiveness. Do you see what our concept is here tonight? Distinguishing between rubble and rubies. When you're standing in that pile of rubble, like those images that we shared at the outset, it's hard to see anything good. Can you imagine seeing a couple of rubies lying in that rubble in New York City or in those images of the Bahamas? How hard it would be to see something valuable amongst all that destruction. And yet this was what figuratively was going on in Joseph's life, but every time he was able to find the spiritual ruby before him. Perhaps the best example is one of the most popular verses that we know of Joseph, and that is found in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. You'll recall his brothers are before him as they come to get food during the famine. They are apologetic to Joseph, saying, "We are so sorry for what we did to you many years ago." And Joseph, with these very famous words, says in verse 20, "As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, to bring it about that many people should be kept alive as they are today." Rubble turned to ruby. And so the question tonight, for the few minutes that we have left, is what about you and me? We've just walked through Joseph. We've just walked through how he, time and time again, had the ability to distinguish the goodness that was amongst him, even though things were bad and evil. But how do you and I do that? Well, I would ask you for just a moment to again reflect before we jump into just a couple thoughts. What examples do you have in your life where you have found rubies amongst rubble? Do you have some examples? Perhaps you've had some hard times. Perhaps you've had some crisis. Perhaps you've had some things challenging you. And were you able to find the rubies in that rubble? It's helpful for us to reflect upon that. It's helpful for us to think about that. It's helpful for us to realize that at times we do just that. But oftentimes it's not that easy. And so that's the crux of our class tonight. I'd like to take you to a passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. I want to spend just a couple of quick minutes with you in this passage. I think there are 4 things that we find in this passage that help us be able to make a ruby in the midst of rubble. And so let's look at this passage together. Paul's writing to the brethren at Thessalonica here, and he says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 15, "See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to every one." That concept is very similar to what we just read in Genesis chapter 50, verse 20, the approach that Joseph did. He did not choose to render evil with evil to his brothers, but he rather rendered good to them. Very strong correlation to this passage. But let's continue in verse 16. Paul says, "Rejoice always, pray without ceasing, give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Do not quench the spirit, do not despise prophecies, but test everything, hold fast what is good." Would you just reflect upon those verses with me for just a moment tonight? Would you think just a bit about what these passages tell us? I would offer to you that we can distinguish between rubble and rubies when, and I want to share 4 things from this passage for you, when, number 1, prayer matters. Did you see what Paul said here in verse 17? Paul says, pray without ceasing. This concept here is an inferior, outcrying to someone who is superior. Us going to our God constantly in prayer, realizing that we need Him, our dependence upon our God. And when we have a heart and a mind that's constantly in prayer, when prayer matters in our life, it is so much easier for us to see the rubies amongst the rubble that we might be in during our life. And we must be reminded of that. If you've not had the chance to do so, I would take you back to our past Sunday evening. This past Sunday evening, we had a song service. And the opening of that song service, a virtual song service that is recorded for you, and it's on our website at charlestonroad.org, so please feel free to engage with that. Roger opened up with some words of encouragement about the importance of prayer. And I would encourage you to go back and look at that and refresh your memory of what Roger said about how important it is that prayer matters in our life. But I want to remind you of a few things that you likely know but may have forgotten. Why is it important that we pray? Well, God governs by prayer. I love the passage in Psalms 106, verse 23, where David is recounting the fact that God was ready to destroy all of Israel for their sins had not Moses stood before God and prayed on their behalf. And God relented and did not destroy them. God governs by our prayers. Prayer matters. When you are in rubble of your life, remember that you have the God, the Creator, the one who governs by prayer on your side, and He is listening for your prayer. Remember that God's grace and power come through prayer. James chapter 5, verse 16 talks about the fact that the fervent prayer of a righteous man will avail much. God's blessings flow from the prayer of His servants. Remember that prayer leads to great works. John says in John chapter 14, verses 12 through 13, truly, truly, I say to you, whoever believes in me will also do the works that I do, and greater works than these will he do, because I am going to the Father. Whatever you ask in my name, this I will do, that the Father may be glorified in the Son. Prayer matters. Reflecting upon God's goodness, the great works of our God, reminds us that we can find those rubies when we're in rubble. I also want to just highlight very quickly from 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 1 and 2, that the Scriptures teach us that prayer transforms societies. First of all, Timothy says, then I urge that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgivings be made for all people, for kings and all who are in high positions, that we may lead a peaceful and quiet life, godly and dignified in every way. Friends, your prayer matters. And even when we stand in the rubble of division and a rubble of a lot of noise around us, and in a society that is just going haywire, we must be reminded that God hears our prayers and acts and transforms societies on the prayers of His children. Prayer saves. Romans chapter 10, verse 1. Brothers, my heart's desire and prayer to God for them is that they may be saved. Paul said, I'm praying for you, brethren. I'm praying that you will be saved, and our God hears those prayers. And then let's not forget, we don't want you to be a casualty in the rubble. And oftentimes Satan is there ready to just snare you when you're in the rubble of life, because you are distracted, you are weak, you are vulnerable. But I want you to be reminded of Luke chapter 22, verse 32. But I have prayed for you that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned again, strengthen your brothers. That passage is telling us that we must pray for one another, that Satan will not take our faith away, that we will not be led away from our God, that our faith will not fail. So, how can we distinguish between rubble and rubies? We can do so when prayer matters in our life. But secondly, here in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, I would say that we can distinguish between rubble and rubies when the fire continues to burn. We see here in the passage that Paul says, don't quench the Spirit. Don't quench the zeal that you have for God. Don't do anything that's going to cause you to, to step away from God and from His work. Be focused. Continue to have a passion for wanting to serve Him. I'm very mindful tonight for those that are listening. There's all types of stories behind this camera lens right now, sitting on your couch and in your homes. There may be the young mother who's at home right now with children, feeling just overwhelmingly discouraged. You've been trying to hold up the family. You've been trying to keep school going. You've been trying to take care of keeping everyone healthy. You've been trying to manage the pressures of life, and it's been a difficult year. And you may just be tired, and you may just be saying, I don't know that I can continue on. It may be that you're sitting at home tonight and you're a high school student and you've had a tough time. You've been in and out of school. You've been disconnected from friends. You've been distracted with what's going on. Your routines, the kinds of milestones that you would be expecting in your life right now aren't happening because so many things have been disrupted. And it's very easy that you could just say, what's the point? Why am I even trying? Why am I even trying to go after a spiritual life in this world that's just gone chaotic in so many ways? It very well may be that you're one of our ministers or one of our evangelists. You may just be tired. You may be at home and you may have been serving the Lord for years, and you still are serving, but you just feel like you're on that treadmill of continuing to feed others, and you've been trying to feed others through these very difficult times. You've been trying to encourage one another, and yet it just seems at times that things are discouraging and you may just be wore out. I can go on and on and on with the list of examples that we might have of situations that you may find yourself in tonight, the rubble in your life. Friends, I'm reminding you, you can find rubies in the rubble of life when your zeal is strong, when your heart is growing toward God, when you allow the fire, the love, the zeal, the desire that you have for our God to be in your home and in your hearts each day. It is when that spirit is quenched that we begin to just succumb to the rubble around us. I want you to think just a moment about a concept that we've talked about in the past. We've talked a bit about the spiritual dashboard of life. We've talked about the fuel that we put into our bodies from a spiritual perspective. We've talked about the temperature of our heart, much like the temperature gauge is on a dashboard. We've talked about the speedometer. How quickly are you moving forward? And I want to ask you just to reflect upon that concept again, even this very evening. Maybe just at the conclusion of this, just jot down for 5 minutes, where are you on the dashboard spiritually? Are you moving? Is your speedometer engaged and you're moving forward? How's your temperature on your engine? Do you have zeal? Do you have a passion to serve God? How are you doing with the fuel? Are you maybe like an empty tank right now? You just don't have anything else to draw upon? Friends, if you're feeling like that, it's time to reach out. Let us help you. You have shepherds, you have evangelists, you have church family members who are willing to help you, but don't allow that tank to go dry. Don't allow that spirit to be quenched, because when it is, you will not be able to find the rubies amongst the rubble. You will become a casualty of the spiritual rubble around you. Satan will pull you under. We can distinguish between rubble and rubies when prayer matters, when the fire burns, and thirdly, when we hold fast. Did you see what is said in verse 21? Hold fast to our God. This really comes from the root of a nautical term. It's a nautical term that really talks about a ship holding firm toward the land, to steer toward the land. It is very similar to maybe locking in a GPS coordinate and just having that GPS go right to a fixed point. That is the concept here. Fix onto God. Grasp Him. Hold tightly to Him. Do not let go. Steer toward the goal. Jason last week in his sermon mentioned the cornerstone of Jesus. That is what we are steering our life toward. That is what we're steering our life around. We are to hold fast to what that model is. We are not to slip away from that. Don't allow life to define where your life is going. Don't allow life to take you down the paths of moving away from God. When you hold fast and you are firmly fixed upon God as your Lord, upon Christ as your cornerstone, you'll be able to find those rubies in life. God will be there for you to help you overcome so that you do not become a victim of the rubble that's around you. And then finally tonight, I would just ask you to realize we can distinguish between rubble and rubies when rubies are non-negotiable. Now you might be saying, Brent, I don't know what you mean there. What do you mean by the fact that rubies are non-negotiable? Would you go back for a moment and look at the passage in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5? I've highlighted a couple words that I just want to have you really reflect upon for just a moment. See that no one repays anyone evil for evil, but always seek to do good to one another and to everyone. Rejoice always. Pray without ceasing. Give thanks in all circumstances, for this is the will of God in Christ Jesus for you. Do not quench the Spirit. Do not despise prophecies, but test everything and hold fast what is good. Do you see the absolutes in all of those words? Always, everyone, without ceasing, in all circumstances. Do not, everything. Friends, it is God's point of view that rubies are not negotiable. It is not acceptable to say, well, I'll seek to do good to one another and to just some people when I feel like it, or some people who haven't wronged me too poorly, or to some people that I like better than others. That's not the concept here. Regardless, if your own brothers throw you in a pit and sell you into slavery, into another land, still do good to them. They are part of everyone. Rejoice always. You may be sitting in a prison and someone has forgotten you, and for years you're sitting there. It's not an excuse not to rejoice. Continue to rejoice in the love your God has for you. Pray without ceasing. It doesn't say pray when you feel like it. Pray when you're only in trouble. Pray when it's the last resort. It says be in constant prayer with our God. In all circumstances, regardless of whether you're at home with those children and you're overwhelmed, whether you're an evangelist who's tired and the treadmill just seems to be going too quickly, whether you are that high school student who is struggling, whether you're Joseph who has been wronged in so many ways, whether you're fill in the blank, whatever your circumstance, God says give thanks. That's the heart of the Christian. That's where you find the rubies, even when you're in in the rubble of life. And so I hope that you'll think about the fact that rubies are not negotiable, friends. God expects us as His people to have the heart that as life mounts around us, as the rubble grows around us from time to time, we rise up and we remember that we can make rubies out of rubble when prayer is a center part of our life, when the fire burns brightly and deeply within our heart, when we hold fast and steer our life toward the cornerstone of Jesus Christ and God's love, and when rubies are non-negotiable in our life, and we realize that regardless of our circumstances, we're going to rise up and make the best of it, and we're going to rejoice, and we're going to pray, and we're going to do good in all circumstances. I hope this class has been helpful for you tonight. I hope these thoughts have been encouraging to you. I'd love to talk with you some more about them. If you have questions, let me know. We'll be glad to engage you. I know Roger would be glad to talk with you about this class. Remember that image that we started with, rubble. Whether you're thinking about it from the terms of the people of God in Nehemiah chapter 4, standing on the wall of Jerusalem had been torn down, whether you're thinking about that rubble after 9/11 in New York City, you're thinking about that rubble in the Bahamas after the hurricane. You see that rubble, you see that image, and you relate to that because your life feels like that right now. Remember, you can find the rubies just as Joseph did time and time again when you go to God. We're here to help you in any way that we can. Thank you for being here. I hope it's been encouraging to you. Next week, the Lord willing, Roger will continue this series, Rise and Build, Reflections from the Joseph story, and he will be taking you through conquering a tainted past. I appreciate you being here. I hope you have a good rest of the week, and thank you.